Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be listening to this presentation that I have been asked to deliver for the ICLASP conference, which was to be held in Hong Kong using a face-to-face mode many years past. And I regret that we have not yet overcome COVID challenge, and so we must do this in the online default mode. I would much have preferred being able to talk with you all, to observe your reactions as I go through this rather lengthy, and I am concerned and perhaps turgid presentation, and then to be able to follow up either during the conference time or perhaps over meals or coffee breaks in our regular conferencing mode. Well, perhaps sometime in the future, but we'll have to make do as we've all been adapting, of course. The challenge of COVID over these last 3 years, certainly in Hong Kong, everywhere. So many of you are listening to this keynote among the other keynotes for this conference because you've read the abstract that I was asked to produce by way of introduction to what I was going to say. And if you read that introductory abstract, then you will know that what I'm giving here are my reflections on my personal intellectual journey into the maze of culture over these last 50 years, really, since I began my journey to the East, which of course was a journey to the West. As I came from Canada initially, then the United States after my graduate degree, into life in Asia. Japan first, and now Hong Kong for the last many years. So who is this guy? Well, he's a social personality psychologist, interested in the very broad question, why does a person respond the way he or she does, when and where he or she does so? I'm looking at the full range of factors that may influence our individual psychological responses, not only ours, but of course that of the others who we study. And when one is outside one's birth culture, one is always aware that you are dealing with other, and reciprocally that they are dealing with you as an other. Well, this is the job, broadly speaking, of social psychology, and I gladly embrace it, made more salient by the fact that I am outside my birth culture and have spent most of my life outside my birth culture, as many of you will have done as well. So this is my background over the last 56 years. And I use the expression stranger in a strange land because that emphasizes the kind of drama that we undergo as we function in a rather strange place. And I use this picture from Salvador Dali, which presents a world that is just slightly off-center which has some degrees of familiarity, but much strangeness attached to it, and suggests that the journey into otherness involves making sense of and learning to navigate, if I can use the standard British metaphor of naval journeying throughout my talk. I am, after all, an English Canadian by birth, and we inherit some of the metaphorical structures of the English language, which, descending from the British naval tradition, are infused with these sorts of nautical metaphors. Well, one of the advantages of the outsider-insider dynamic is that it provokes questions. It stimulates searches for answers. The broad question of what's going on here, that's the puzzle that I have been dealing with personally and intellectually, if we can make that distinction between what is personal and what is intellectual. And I'm going to take you down that rather long journey. It's the best I can offer at this stage of my career, I think, so that you can benefit from the struggle, the welcome struggle that I've undertaken these last more than half century. So just to craft our terms of engagement here, let me say that my question was always what to present when accepting to be a keynote speaker at the IALSP when Hans first approached me. Gosh, maybe 4 years ago as we speak. And my answer was to address a topic that reflects my growing understanding about practicing social psychology since crossing the Pacific in 1971. My outcome of interest from giving this talk is to warn and inform, inspire psychologists who might want to bring culture into their research enterprise. I should say at the outset that it's a risky undertaking, fraught with all kinds of challenges, not all of which I have resolved after these half century. So, be forewarned. My hope is that, of course, we can benefit, you can benefit from standing on my shoulders and the shoulders of others, of course, who have gone before. So I'm going to take you down my pilgrim's progress, I might say. I use that extended metaphor, John Bunyan, throughout my talk, describe various stages that move through. These stages I deem to be four, and I'm going to call them 4 shades of brown, so that I can distinguish each stage by using a different shade of brown in this PowerPoint. You will have noticed I use colors in my PowerPoint. I've always appreciated colors and found the advantage of PowerPoint to be that I can present more than black and white words to try and emphasize and underscore whatever I'm presenting. So here from William Blake is these representations of what I think are the stages of my own development. These are, of course, personal, but they're also disciplinary because I've arrived at a stage where I can look back and realize that my beginning was, in fact, the beginning of a concentrated growing concentration of interest in culture as a factor that influenced people's psychological responses. Each of these stages developed historically across time, with each stage continuing as the succeeding stages emerge. There's a kind of blending across time here of these different stages. Each is associated with a different component of the social scientific process, which I'll attempt to describe. Stage number one, in this rather faint shade of brown, is Aristotle and what I call the Eureka Stage, which involved essentially the dynamic of discovering a cultural difference in some kind of psychological response. Second stage I call the Mercator Stage, and the dynamic here was what I call psychography. That is to say, the mapping of psychological differences across many cultures around the globe. Third, in yet a darker, deeper color of brown, is associated with Wundt, great German psychologist of the late 19th, early 20th century, and I call it the Psychological Unpackaging Stage. And that involves explaining cultural differences by using psychological factors. Finally, in the darkest shade of brown, we have Bronfenbrenner, famous developmental clinical cultural psychologist, and what he called the bio-ecological system stage. That's quite a mouthful. It involves explaining cultural differences more fully by using both psychological and cultural factors to explain why we observe difference in psychological response across these many cultural groups that we have begun discovering. And what happens at the end of this process?
What we discover is what I call my city of light. Again, to use Bunyan's metaphorical journey towards the city of light, which is his arrival at the destination of his intellectual journey. Well, mine is the scientific understanding of human social behavior, which includes culture as one of its factors. All right, I will explain these different stages in different degrees of detail. Okay, so this is my version of the Eureka Stage, number one. And what we're doing here is constructing a social psychology of the Chinese people. I term this rather cheekily chasing the dragon. And what we're doing in chasing the dragon, scientific style, inside social psychology, is to compare the Chinese dragon to the Western dragon. And there is one of our typical visions of the Western dragon. And here's a rather more elegant and persuasive vision of the Chinese dragon, embodying many features associated in Chinese culture with the dragon, not only its golden color, but also the degree of balance that you can see in the portrayal of the dragon relative to the Western dragon. And the essential question is, are their members different? Are Chinese persons different from typically termed Western persons? These are very broad categories, as you'll appreciate. But the answer for us was to search for psychological data. That was our domain of interest and focus. Others would, of course, have their approach to understanding the differences. So how did we go about doing business? Well, we engaged in bicultural comparisons. We used theory, constructs, measures, and methodology that was available in the established literature that derived from our training up to that stage. And we then ran whatever empirical study we were doing in both cultural groups. We compared the results and tried to make sense of them as best we could. Many of us, because we were bicultural in the sense of living elsewhere, sometimes working in a different language than our native language, we're able to exploit what I call a surprise factor. That is to say, we will have noticed in our own experience, our own dailiness, living in a different culture, that things are somewhat different here. And so we're well positioned, I must say, to intuit a probable difference on the basis of our own experience. So here I am in this picture way back in the 1980s, working with a very distinguished, soon to be distinguished, psychologist, social psychologist, who was in fact an undergraduate student of mine at the Chinese University. Many of you will recognize Guo Lang, the late Guo Lang. I just give you an example of one of our early studies involving, through our informed collaboration and negotiation interculturally, our discussions about the problem of justice and distributive justice, which resulted in a study we published in 1984 in JPSP, well-known social psych journal. We found simply that Chinese friends were more egalitarian in the way they divided a joint reward. American friends were more equitable, relying upon the distribution of labor that went into the production. So here we have an example of how we might marry Chinese culture to Western culture by looking at differences and trying to explain them in this very basic way that was derived from our own personal experience in part. What was the yield from such enterprise? Well, I'll give you another example of some of the work we did on culture and language differences. I've listed them here. Studies on code switching into English in order to disengage verbal restraint from the restraint that was imposed by Cantonese. Nonverbal shifts when bilinguals are speaking in English compared to Cantonese. Later work on how you perceive yourself when you're speaking in English versus Cantonese to either a Westerner, native speaker of English, or a Cantonese native speaker of Cantonese, working in either English or in Cantonese. So a fully balanced design around language and culture to try and see how the language that you're using with the person, your interlocutor, and that interlocutor's cultural background makes a difference in how you think about yourself, how you feel, and how you perceive yourself during that encounter. Okay, well, what do you get out of all this kind of stuff? You get a t-test difference. Look at the picture at the base of the slide here. This is the kind of data we deal with. This is rather idealized, but you get the idea. We're comparing blue with red here. You might say American or English with Chinese or Cantonese in this case. And you get an average difference symbolized by the two vertical lines here. But I do want everyone to note, and I highlight the color red here, that there's considerable wide variation in individual responses of members from the two cultural groups. So we are, of course, masking the high degree of variability among individual members of the two culture language groups concerned when we simply report on the averages. But as a beginning gesture, that's what we were doing in the early stages, mapping the difference. And the yield was that these are neat findings for building any collection of differences. So that's the basis from which you can begin to accumulate and shape a sense of Chinese Western differences. Of course, it doesn't answer the why question. Why does language culture change produce these shifts? What's going on here is the, of course, fundamental scientific question that we have to use these discoveries to begin generating. Now, there was some pushback, of course, in the early days of doing research on Chinese people. And this was pushback from what's called the indigenous perspective. And let me say a few words about the indigenous perspective, which tries to breathe fire into the realities of Chinese culture that are regarded as being sidelined or overlooked when you do science coming out of at that time, Western scientific tradition. So we enter the dragon. I use the color purple here to symbolize culture in this presentation. So in the search for psychological knowledge, is Chinese culture being adequately represented, or is it even being misrepresented? Are negative stereotypes about the Chinese people being promoted? This was another issue we had to contend with. Isn't established Western psychology itself indigenous and not universal? So why are you bringing over these ideas, these theories, these concepts, these methodologies, if they may be distorting the reality of Chinese psychological life? And what happened, of course, was that as a result of this counterpoint, there was an empowering of intellectual work on a concept called ethnic affirmation as a counterpoint to imposed intellectual imperialism. There were some champions of this movement whom you will recognize, I hope. This is a picture I took of Yang Kuo-shu when he and I were working together in the late 70s. A very articulate and expressive proponent of the nature of Chinese psychological life, who wrote a chapter way back in '86 on the psychology of Chinese people. And he lamented the lack of Chinese developed theory and Chinese constructed scales. And of course, then worked to develop Chinese theory from a Chinese theoretical perspective and philosophical, ideological perspective, and then the associated scales for assessing Chinese people in this regard. Another person was David Ho. Here's David, a colleague in the early 70s and 80s, continuing into the present, who talked about a concept of relationship dominance in Confucian heritage cultures. Here's a quotation from one of his important works published in the Journal of Personality, a mainstream Psychology Journal. David was attempting to realign or refocus or re-emphasize or reprioritize psychology and social psychology from its social cognitive focus to a relational component focus. Something, of course, that has subsequently been picked up by mainstream social psychology, of course, mostly in the 21st century. So it took some time for David's emphasis and concern to be realized slowly in the field. And this Counterpoint, these champions of indigenization, inspired a host of indigenous constructs and their testing to be developed. So we had work on relationship harmony. We had work on role dyads. We had work on disintegration avoidance associated with different scholars in the field as a way to try to rebalance the emphases in the topics of being explored. There was, I should point out, not a rebalancing in terms of the methodology used, however, but rather the cultural inputs to our thinking and our researching. There were problems associated with this dynamic during the Eureka Stage. And the basic question was whether these mean differences are valid. Are they telling us anything useful? Important, true, dare I say, about Chinese culture and Western culture. And I remind us all, as I continue to remind myself, what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. So the way we went about questioning persons, individual members of these cultural systems, was of course crucial to the kinds of results we would get. Methodology drives outcome and understanding. And in this challenge about our methodology, we had something called the equivalence concern, where the measures used and the procedures followed and the data analyzed in equivalent ways for the two cultural groups involved. There's a long discourse in cross-cultural psychology about equivalence and the need for different forms of equivalence to be observed, established. Basically, whatever is metrically the same is not necessarily similar in cultural meaning. And that's, of course, been an ongoing kind of challenge based on the fact that we are research psychologists using methods to gather data and simply establishing that the data we gather is metrically equivalent as taken from various measures does not necessarily mean that the results have the same cultural meaning, and therefore there are challenges to your comparison. Much skepticism about the comparability of the results is simply what happened. Problematics, of course, focus more not only on the methodologies that we used, but also how are we going to explain these differences? Now, usually we relied on what I call ex cathedra pronouncements given by local and bicultural experts who'd had experience in the cultural systems being compared. And I must say that I relied very heavily on these gurus, you might say, because I too was a stranger in a strange land. And they had been down this road in their own experience as academics. And I took their pronouncements quite seriously. They had developed some very rich theoretical constructs and applied them. I was reading with my eyes hanging out, to quote Dylan Thomas, scholars from Japan, like Takeo Doi on Amaisuru, and Francis Hsu on Run, Geertz on individualism, collectivism, Flacon and Strodbeck on dimensions of difference in worldviews, and so forth. Here's Clifford Geertz in one of his professorial modes, and who would not believe a man who looked like this? Wow, I mean, I certainly did. Here's another guy, Richard Schwader. I have huge respect, talking about purity and duty as bases for morality. Here he is giving a conference at the Chinese University back in 2013, keynote presentation. So I absorbed, gobbled up their wisdom as I saw it, and used it to explain ex post facto the kinds of results I was finding. And we all did this. This was what we had to rely on in the early days. Okay, that's the Eureka stage. Let's move into stage number 2, the Mercator stage. And you guys will recognize, I'm sure, that we are trying to address the disciplinary question: what is culture psychologically? In psychological terms, how does culture and a person's culture translate down, you might say, into their particular psychological makeup, constitution, reaction profile, habits, motivations, beliefs at the individual level? Well, I use here Mercator as our guide. As you know, he was the Dutch cartographer whose projection of the continent survives today. Here's Mercator, picture of him from the 16th century. And here's one of his early maps. Wow, what a gift that was to navigators. It was explicitly designed as an aid to navigators who were sailing on hitherto uncharted seas, and even now, at that stage, very badly charted seas, but it was better than looking at the featureless ocean and then waiting for nightfall to use the stars to guide you. Now, Hofstede was a descendant, Dutch descendant, of course, and helped us to map culture psychologically by producing the first typical citizen map. I say typical citizen because he used average scores of people from different cultures to map their national cultures. Here's Geert in one of his professorial modes. You can find many of his videos on YouTube if you want to go down that particular road, which produced these kinds of outcomes, as you see in the map at the bottom. Here is one of his key measures, perhaps his best known measure of national cultural difference. This is individualism, collectivism, color-coded across the countries of the world in which he has measured individualism and collectivism, moving from dark purple through to a kind of pink, light pink, into collectivism. So that was part of the early mapping, which was a very welcome issue for people in different cultural traditions trying to understand cultural differences between their group, their cultural group, national cultural group, and that of others. So this provides comparative dimensions of national culture in psychological terms and provides possible ways to compare national culture A with national culture Z or Z, depending on your culture of origin, and with cultures in between. Okay, so this kind of tradition of psychography has continued, and many of us rely on this tradition. Hofstede's 4 original dimensions have been extended to 5, to 6, and then back again to 2 by Minkoff, who's worked very closely with Hofstede indeed, in order to make sense and valid sense of all this dimensionality, and tried to find the most useful ways to characterize national cultures. And so they produce maps of this sort. Here's Minkoff's map, which uses his dimension of monumentalism flexibility on the abscissa, and uses collectivism, individualism in the ordinate to locate any given national group in space. Here's China, for example. And you see, of course, that what we're beginning to do now is to differentiate cultures. Even Chinese cultures get differentiated. China is not the same as Singapore. They're close, of course. Taiwan is different from China in this mapping. And Hong Kong, I'm not quite sure where Hong Kong is, but anyway, this is not an eye test. But you get the idea that we're beginning to pull the planet apart so that we can begin to differentiate national cultural groups on the basis of their psychological location, you might say. Other people have used beliefs about the world rather than values. This was my work with Guok Leung in 2004. We produced this mapping of beliefs where we contrasted along the ordinate dynamic externality, as we called it, with societal cynicism and located cultures, again, in different parts of what you might call psychological space, which allowed us again to distinguish cultural groups one from another. Oh, the Chinese are somewhat different from the Singaporeans, which are somewhat different from Americans down here, which are somewhat different from the Belgians and the Europeans in general over here. So we were beginning to differentiate, to articulate psychological space around the world using culture scores, scores of national culture, the typical responses of representative citizens. And many people would respond and say, whoa, so that's what Chinese culture is? Yao mo gao chou, as we might say in Cantonese. I can hardly believe it. Ikurishimasita in Japanese. And one of the feelings here, I think, was that our culture was being de-romanticized by this process of mapping. In fact, some people went further and said we were being colonized by weird social science and hence misrepresented by this way of talking about culture and by articulating scientific differences in these ways. Psychography continues apace into the 21st century. We have more representative samples from the World Values Survey to look at national citizen values, and many of you will be familiar with this mapping of cultures using survival and self-expressive values along the abscissa, and then traditional versus secular rational values up the ordinate. Again, grouping cultures into categories here as identified, as decided upon by Engelhardt and Baker. English-speaking, Protestant Europe, Confucian, Catholic Europe, Orthodox, and so forth. And again, this is an attempt to try and pull apart and articulate the concept of culture using psychological measures. It's been done using Big Five personality measures, using behavior, in this case, pace of life, Levine and Roseanne's work, using ultimate outcomes like subjective well-being for national citizenry, You guys are all familiar, I'm sure, with annual surveys of life satisfaction around the world, of happiness around the world, of subjective well-being around the world, which use color codes here to indicate high versus low levels of satisfaction with life, which is a kind of, I call it ultimate outcome, a kind of way of synthesizing and making sense of people's lives. Okay, problematics in this Mercator stage for cross-cultural psychology. Of course, with every stage of development, there are some reactions that we encounter as we explore deeper into the cave, searching for the Minotaur. Nations are not persons. Nationology is not psychology. Individualism, collectivism is not idiocentrism, allocentrism. And so we became alerted to the problem of the ecological fallacy, assuming that a cultural dimension would be represented at the individual level. We failed to appreciate the fact that individuals are embedded within a very large range of cultural settings at different levels of proximity to the individual in terms of their influence. So the question became how to use national psychography to predict individual psychology. It became very complicated as we moved from the national level, as depicted at the top of this Escher picture, lithographed down to the bottom level of individuals. And there were intersecting levels of influence that we realized we had not addressed simply by averaging together individual scores at the base in order to get a description of what a culture was. Well, then we move into stage number 3, and I hope you're still with me. I'm going at quite a pace, but I encourage you, because we do have the advantage of online presentations, to pause the presentation, and if you wish, go back in the presentation. So I apologize going at such speed, but it's a long life that I have been leading, going through this journey. The disciplinary issue for Wundt and the psychological unpackaging stage was, how does culture work to produce a cross-cultural difference? How does it happen? And I'm going to introduce you to the cultural positioning effect as a way in which we typically tried to explain how culture worked. And that is using the premise that psychological outcomes are generated through psychological processes that differ in culture A from culture B. What is the model for this XY process? That is to say, we're working on the assumption that if X is driving Y in this picture here, this graph of influence where X is what you might call the independent variable and Y is the dependent variable, then as you see, higher levels of X will produce higher levels of Y. And we're talking here about the color green because each of these green dots represents a person from culture Y. Whereas in culture red, you see red dots representing individual responses. And you will notice that the average score for level X, predictor variable, the independent variable in culture red, is lower than in the green culture. And consequently, the outcome of interest, the dependent variable, the outcome we're exploring psychologically, is lower in culture red than in culture green. That's the basic idea here, that we're getting differences between the two culture systems, the green culture and the red culture, because of differences in their level of X. We see this work, this approach in the work of Min Sum Kim and her discovery of conversational constraints in Korea and the United States. Wonderful piece of cross-cultural work on language and social psych. She's interested in the concept of strength of concerns to restrain one's conversational input so as not to impose on or disrespect one's conversational partner. And she argued that and found that these were higher among Koreans than among Americans. On the other hand, the strength of concern to enhance clarity of the other person's understanding of one's utterance was higher among Americans. So you get this contrasting balance of interest in terms of what are the constraints that motivate Koreans relative to Americans, and vice versa, the constraints that motivate Americans relative to Koreans. This is called the unpackaging problem, and unpackaging involves these constraint differences. And to unpackage these differences in observed constraints, Kim focused on what's called independent self-construal in psychological terms, so that people who had higher interdependent self-construals then emphasized on producing less imposition on their interlocutors. If you had a higher independent self-construal, then your emphasis was on greater clarity. And this was the research she published in HCR, Human Communication Research, in '94, to try and explain why the Koreans emphasized restraint concerns and the Americans influence independent concerns. Americans were relatively more concerned with clarity. Koreans relatively more concerned with avoiding restraint, exercising restraint, avoiding imposition on their interlocutors. So that's a psychological factor that explains the differences she observed. And the argument, of course, was that cultural collectivism is higher in Korea. Cultural individualism is higher in the USA. That was a presumption, of course. Typically, it was justified by looking at Hofstede's earlier data. Okay, well, there's some problematics in this stage of psychological unpackaging. And I symbolize them here in terms of the equivalence issues. Were they adequately managed in the comparison that we're drawing? Continuing discussion about equivalence. A question of could there be some other psychological factor responsible for driving the cultural difference? Because when we tried to unpack differences in Y using the variable X, we typically found that we had not unpackaged the difference completely. There were probably other factors, psychological factors that may be generating the difference. What would they be? Another problem was only 2 or 3 cultural groups typically were involved, and so we had a generalizability challenge. We found this difference for Americans and Koreans. Oh, would you find the same difference for British persons and Vietnamese, for example? Well, we don't know. We presume, but presumption is to be avoided in exploring culture, of course. Some surprises. We've typically found a moderation effect. Occasionally, the cultural group interacted with X to predict Y, so that the effect of X on Y was much stronger in some groups, the black group, than in the red group, as you see here, in terms of predicting the outcome. Interdependent self-construal was a stronger predictor of constraint against imposing on others among South Koreans than among the Americans. So this factor of interdependent self-construal worked differently and was more impactful on Korean behavior than on American behavior. Similarly, independent self-construal was a stronger predictor of constraint for clarity among the Americans than among the South Koreans, as Kim found later in communication monographs. So, yes, interdependent self-construals helped us to explain, but they didn't explain it as well as they could because the effect of culture varied in this respect. And we began to ask the question of whether culture could operate by making certain elements in a general model for social behavior relatively more powerful in one culture than in another culture. This is what we subsequently called the nuancing effect of culture. Yes, there's a pan-cultural relationship between self-construal and behavior, but in some cultural groups, it works more strongly and differently than in others. What are those others and why? So, is culture then a salience induction? And I use this graph and pictorial representation to try and suggest that the impact of X on Y will vary in its strength and intensity as a function of culture. Here, X predicts the psychological outcome of interest Y at varying strengths of saturation, if I can use that metaphor. And that strength of saturation then becomes the true cultural effect. If variation in predictor strength of X on Y is found from cultural group to cultural group, how can we explain this variation? This is a provocative issue that emerged out of stage number 3, the cultural unpackaging stage, because we found that we could not always perfectly adequately unpackage. Is culture functioning as a kind of background variable to make certain ecocultural conditions more salient in producing the psychological outcome? Cautionary note, there are many eco-social contexts within the workhorse context of the nation. Each individual is embedded in many cultural settings at any given moment. These are all hierarchically organized at varying proximities to the individual, as exemplified in this diagram about influences on individual behavior. Cultural residues are also embedded within the bicultural or polycultural individual. So it's complicated. And where do we go from here? We go into the Bronfenbrenner stage, biological systems, ecological system stage. I give you notes here at this point. I'm realizing that I'm carrying on as usual and will not be able to finish this very satisfactorily. So I invite you to go through at your own pace what I'm presenting here in terms of the Bronfenbrenner model, the assumptions that he's making, concluding with the daunting multiplicity of cultural influences to consider. So emerging approach for cross-cultural social psychology then became culture as a shared normative context and cultural systems arising from ecological, historical, social circumstances. These are what Barry called background variables in the model I'm presenting below, leading to process variables by which individual members of cultural systems get socialized to become the psychologically defined individuals and distinctive individuals that they are. Cultural systems function by socializing members to live within a normative context. And if we can begin understanding that socialization process, we'll begin understanding where those psychological differences come from and appreciating that they come from vastly different cultural traditions, which may leave their imprint differently, leading, as I say here, to the psychological variables that you see at the base. Okay, so how do we conceptualize individual responses in social settings across multiple cultural groups? We're now going polycultural, not simply bicultural or tricultural. So we look at roles, we look at how norms are established for these roles and how individuals learn to play their role in situations leading to individual responses. Cultural level processes then may mediate or moderate individual genetic-based developmentally socialized profiles of motives and beliefs and situationally based subjective norms, yielding within culture individual responses in any cultural group. So we're back to this representation of the complexity by which culture filters down into individual psychological processes through the socially created normative structure for playing your different roles in life, where this normative structure emerges from the ecological and cultural heritage, ideological, philosophical, religious, and economic that form the crystallization of culture to that point, and acknowledging that across time, as we begin to do longitudinal studies of culture, these normative contexts are going to begin shifting so that the socialization of new members into a cultural system will also change, and leading to the observed responses that we as cross-cultural social psychologists interested in language and all the other human responses are able to begin understanding more fully by incorporating a larger sense and understanding of what is culture and how does it impact on the psychological processes of individuals. Okay, I'm sorry that I put as much as I did into this lecture, and I invite you to go through it at your own speed later in order to understand it more fully. Of course, I'm available. I answer emails from interested colleagues if you would like to follow up in any way online. I'm sorry we cannot do so face to face, but maybe in a subsequent conference for IALSP. I thank you for your attention at this point and wish you a happy subsequent keynote addresses and conference participation. Thank you all. Bye for now.